Hello, everybody. This is Nahaz, and men lie, women lie, but stats don't lie. Welcome to episode 6. We're going to talk a little bit about Shanghai, and yeah, after this particular tournament, I may have to change the name of the series. The stats did lie, by the way, just to clarify. The name of the series is ironic. The asterisk is part of the title because obviously stats do lie sometimes. I still get some YouTube and Reddit comments about that. But anyway, on with the show here. So I think we're going to talk in this episode about who I think came out of Shanghai as the big winners and the big losers. And we're going to take a look ahead at Manila because direct invites are going to go out from Manila in about 6 weeks. And I think we actually know quite a bit about what the picture is going to look like then. But first on the list has got to be talking about SEA Dota as well as the role of coaching and team analysts in the scene moving forward. If you look at SEA Dota, in 5 or 6, almost 6 years now of Valve-hosted LAN Dota 2 events, there had been 3 SEA teams total that had finished in the top 6. You saw Scythe at the first international held in Berlin. You saw Zenith at TI2 and Orange at TI3. Those were the only top 6 finishers out of the SEA region, while Fnatic and MVP both finished at the top 6 at Shanghai at the same tournament. This is really an unprecedented success story for this particular region. We'll talk a little bit about why I find that so unlikely as we go on here, but obviously just an impressive performance by both teams. I know Gods got quite emotional talking about these teams, and with very, very good reason. This is really, I think, potentially a springboard for the growth of Dota 2 in that particular region. And you look at the teams that they beat as well as they lost to. I've heard a couple people express some skepticism about the performance of SEA teams in this particular event. I don't share that skepticism at all. I think you look at the playoff series that they play, they had playoff wins over LGD, OGD, and Newbie. I know we're going to talk about this on the next slide. I know Chinese teams disappointed at this event, but you can't argue with the talent on those rosters. And moreover, to me, if you look at the series that they lost, the only losses in playoff series to an opponent outside of SEA at Shanghai were both to EG. EG knocked Fnatic down to the losers bracket originally, and then of course eliminated MVP Phoenix eventually in the losers bracket as well. So I don't really think you can question what these teams did at this event. They were incredibly impressive. The other thing I want to talk about are coaches and analysts, because I think that this is really a movement you're going to see a lot of in the scene going forward. I think any team that's not using coaches and to some extent also not using analysts is giving up a huge advantage. You look at 3 out of the top 6 teams at this event that we know of used coaches. I actually still think that MVP Phoenix probably had some kind of coaching going into this event as well. That's not, to my knowledge, publicly available information, but we do know that 3 out of the top 6 teams and 2 of the top 3, in fact, the 2 grand finalists, both used coaches extensively during this event. Secret, of course, had a pre-existing relationship with 1437 dating back to the old roster last year. They used him. He was clearly a contributor, was credited by the team after the event. Liquid used Bulba, and they were both of those two clearly played a big role. Bulba, by the way, I know had at least 3 teams that were considering his services before this event. These two are, people talk about NA Dota struggling to grow, but these two are 2 of the more knowledgeable players that I've interacted with anywhere on the scene. They're clearly in huge demand for their talents. I do think DC is hopefully eventually going to have some success, but those 2 players, I root for them to succeed individually about as hard as I root for anybody in Pro Dota 2 just because of their game knowledge, and they also happen to both be just tremendous individuals. Fnatic, I want to give a big shout out to Extinct. Extinct's a player that's been around on the SEA scene for quite some time, and I have really very rarely seen a team turn around as quickly as Fnatic. Fnatic had been eliminated in the group phase or in the first round at 5 straight lands coming into Shanghai. This is something that I pointed out when I did the team preview of them in a previous video. They had been eliminated as soon as they possibly could have gone out in 5 straight international lands in which they had competed. And in Shanghai, not not only do they finish top 2 in their group, but they go on and they finish top 6 in the tournament overall. And I just think if you had watched this team in those previous events, so many of their drafts just made absolutely no sense. I'm probably being a little bit harsh there, but I don't feel that they used bans well at all. I feel like they routinely would waste at least 1 or 2 bans in every single one of their drafts. MVP is another team. I think if you looked at them competing in online matches against SEA competition right before Shanghai, their drafts really had absolutely no cohesion whatsoever a lot of the time. Both of those teams, I think, coming into this event, their picks were very good, but I think their bans were on point as well. They clearly did a lot of preparation, and I think had a lot of help in terms of preparing for those drafts, and that makes a really big difference. And I think you look at Secret, another aspect of coaching and analysis that I think is really underrated. People talk about preparing for events, but it's also the ability to make adjustments during events. We talk all the time about LANs evolve their own metagame. Teams need to make changes. A lot of people attribute much of EG's success to their ability to make adjustments during events. But that's very hard to do because you have your players spending a lot of time competing, spending a lot of time looking at heroes for opponents. You don't necessarily have the time to make those fine-tuned adjustments to your gameplay. And I feel like coaches can really help you do that. And the example I give is you look at Secret. Secret were absolutely crushed in 2 games in the group phase against MVP Phoenix and came back and were able to just dominate throughout the upper bracket of the playoffs. I think some of the adjustments that they made moving from group phase into the playoff bracket were huge. And guys, the other thing that I'll shoot down, maybe I'll save this for later in the video, is kind of my third myth that I'll bust. But a lot of people talk about group phases in these tournaments not mattering, and that's a real pet peeve of mine. And anyway, the final thing that I'll mention along the lines of coaches and analysts is this is something I was very critical of Liquid about when we did the preview of Shanghai, that if you took the top 3 arguably Western teams going into Shanghai and the top 3 arguably Chinese teams going into the event, that Liquid were only 2-4 against all of that competition before Shanghai started. They had by far the fewest games played, and they had an unimpressive record against those teams. They were clearly able to make that transition to playing and competing against elite caliber competition absolutely seamlessly. Of course, Kuro gets a lot of credit for that as captain. Puppy gets a lot of credit for that with Secret, but I do think those coaches played a huge role for those 2 teams in particular. All right, Chinese Dota. I've kind of been over this in the articles that I wrote on ESPN, but I think this is just such a big story that we have to talk about it again here. It's hard for me. As you guys know, I follow a lot of other sports. It's actually hard for me to come up with an equivalent in another sport of a region or a conference failing as hard and as completely as China did in Shanghai. Chinese teams went 2-11 in best of 3 or best of 1 series against non-Chinese opponents. The only 2 wins came against Archon, which was statistically either the weakest or second weakest team in the field. The 5 Chinese teams combined, we were all excited. I imagine a number of Chinese fans were excited to go to that Mercedes-Benz Arena and watch Chinese teams playing live. Well, there were 43 playoff maps played at that Mercedes-Benz Arena, and only 8 of those games featured Chinese teams. This was a massive, massive disappointment. And the thing that really confuses me, I actually thought that Chinese Dota was headed in a pretty good direction coming into these tournaments. Younger players were starting to see opportunities on the big name Chinese rosters, which is something that a lot of people had criticized them for in the past. But again, it's dangerous to talk about this right now because we kind of don't know all of what these rosters are going to look like. We don't know, for example, what CDC's final roster is going to look like. We're not sure what LGD's roster is going to look like, although we're fairly sure now that it's going to feature aggressive at the carry position. But even what I've seen of the post-Shanghai roster shuffles, it really, really worries me. Vici Gaming's decision to bring in ROTK to the main squad after he really had kind of a tumultuous time as captain of LGD. FY being bumped to the potential squad along with DDC, supposedly, who's 25 years old right now. That seems really strange if your focus is on developing younger players. EHOME lose CTY, which I think is really... that's a blow to them, but then they decide to move Lanham back to carry. Lanham does have a history of that position. Lanham had a 768 last hit game as Tiny in the International a couple years back, which but at that time anyway was nearly unheard of. But it's concerning to me that, if anything, a lot of the major Chinese squads may be reacting to this by getting older at their core positions. I don't think that's the right direction in which to move. And 11, who I thought was one of the more promising, if not the most promising young player in the Chinese scene before Shanghai, is currently teamless. I'm sure he's going to end up somewhere. But to me, as much as I am an iceiceice fanboy, if I'm building a team, I'm looking to build a team around a player like 11 right now, maybe even more so than at this point in his career, iceiceice. So we're going to have to see. I'm a little bit concerned about that scene going forward. All right, meta-wise, big winners, and I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, are going to be your junglers and your split pushing heroes. Enigma goes 12-5 at this event. He has the second highest win rate of any hero with 10 or more games. Slark had the highest at 10-4. Obviously, as a situational hero, he's gained a lot of momentum in the metagame as well, and it's partly because he can farm very effectively in the jungle himself. Chen was only 9-9 in this event, so it may seem strange that I would put his picture up at the top, but he was the second most banned hero. Earth Spirit was the most banned by a lot, but really teams were very aware of the Chen pick. You saw a lot of first phase bans, particularly against teams with notable Chen players coming in. So the 9-9 record, I think, is a lot stronger than it looked like. And Nature's Prophet, this was the one hero when we were talking about our compendium predictions for most picked. This is the one hero that I don't even think we seriously considered, and Nature's Prophet ended up being tied with Vengeful Spirit for the second most picks at the event. He was only 18-18, but again, I think when you look at the influence that a hero has had on the meta, you have to look at how contested he was overall, not just the number of picks, and you have to look at how influential he was in individual games. Nature's Prophet really dictated the pace of a lot of the matches in which he appeared during the tournament. As far as most picked hero, Invoker comes out on top just barely, 37 picks, so I did get that one wrong. The nerf to Deafening Blast had a lot less of an impact than people thought it was going to have, or than I thought it was going to have. Take some responsibility before the tournament. That's a little bit, to me, inflated. One of the questions that we asked about Secret going into Shanghai was, what was that hero pool going to look like for We? Because obviously that Wind Ranger, that Meepo that had worked so well for him in the previous patch, both really out of favor in the metagame currently. And the answer, not surprisingly, I remember vividly last year at ESL New York, Hani was there and he was telling me Weeha was probably the best Invoker player at that tournament, and he thought at that point the best in the world. While he was 6-2 on Invoker, including undefeated in the playoffs, absolutely rocked on that hero. Secret did pick up Nature's Prophet as well, but they weren't nearly as reliant. So I'd argue you take away that 6-2 from Secret on Invoker, he looks a little bit weaker. Nature's Prophet, I think, is still present more throughout the meta, at least much more than we would have expected. Bounty Hunter. Now, this is a little bit weird. This hero was only picked 7 times in the tournament, so how am I calling him a winner after Shanghai? It seems like a little bit of a ridiculous statement. Two things. Number one, you looked at the number of teams that banned him. He was tied with Enchantress for the 5th most banned hero in this tournament, and I think that will come as a surprise to many people, particularly when you look at the ratio of bans to picks. Bounty Hunter was banned a lot more than he was picked. And if you look at the trend in pubs since then, Bounty Hunter has become the number 4 most picked hero in 5K or higher ranked public matches this month. He's number 2 overall. He's got over a 57% win rate in those matches. And the funny thing is, if you look at the roles he's playing in those matches, Dota Buff has this wonderful new feature under the Heroes tab. If you click Heroes, there's a meta feature. It's awesome. Anybody that's interested in stats should definitely check that out. And if you look at the roles that Bounty Hunter is playing in those matches, it's mostly mid and jungle. And I think this makes a lot of sense when you look at he's harassing your invokers and your outworld devourers in that mid role. He's preventing them from snowballing out of control. And he's also very effective at contesting the jungle. I sent a tweet during Shanghai that I felt like a lot of teams, including a few of the top teams, had forgotten how to counter junglers. It's almost like since that 6.83 meta and jungling going away in favor of stack farming, we've forgotten how to contest the jungle early. PPD replied with kind of a sarcastic response saying, well, how do you contest junglers? It's not obvious in this meta, but the Bounty Hunter pick to me is one of the most effective ways to do that, as well as countering those hard farming mids. And I think when you put the two together, Bounty Hunter is a hero that's going to get a lot more attention, both in pubs and in pros going forward. As far as the biggest losers in this event, you look at the Morphling. Morphling was actually a hero I thought was going to do very well. It just so happened a number of the teams that I was relying on to make Morphling successful were those Chinese teams. I thought that you were going to see Sylar in particular have a lot of success on Morphling. And this is just a case where a lot of the compendium predictions, the utter failure of those Chinese teams just kind of blows it all to hell. You can't, when you're looking at these tournaments, you can't predict hero performance without predicting team performance, or at least they're very highly related. So I think that a lot of those got screwed up. But Earthshaker and Ember were a little bit of a disappointment as well. I was particularly surprised. I thought if you would have told me before the tournament that Secret was going to be so successful, I would have told you that Ember Spirit was going to end up with a little bit of a better record. But in fact, Envy only played as Ember Spirit once in the entire tournament, and they picked it for Wii a couple of times even. So that hero definitely was not up to expectations. So, pardon me. All right, sorry about that. I know nothing about video editing, so I do these in one take. But the big losers, you know, my Nahaz fail there, were the stats and the auto invites coming into this tournament. So I've had this discussion with a number of people about the automatic invite structure for majors. And just to put my cards on the table, for months and months now, I've been arguing that it should be 6 direct invites and 10 qualifier slots. And I think Shanghai is yet another example of why. So Frankfurt, you ask between Frankfurt and Shanghai, which was typical and which was atypical. Well, both tournaments had 8 directly invited teams and 8 qualifiers, 2 awarded to each region. At Frankfurt, 7 out of the 8 invited teams finished top 2 in the group, and 7 out of the 8 finished top 8 in the tournament overall. OG, who won the tournament from the lower bracket, was the only team was the only qualified team to finish in the top 8. Okay, Shanghai, absolutely the polar opposite. Each group, it turns out, in Shanghai had exactly 1 invite and 1 qualified team in the top 2 out of 4. In fact, MVP Phoenix was the only qualifier team in Group A, along with Secret and EHOME, and MVP went 4-0 and won the group. And then, of course, you can't argue with these playoff results, guys. 4 out of the top 6 finishers in this tournament were qualified teams: Liquid, Complexity, MVP, and Fnatic. So I think you ask yourself, you look at these 2 major tournaments and you say, all right, which one was typical? And I say that's a no-brainer. You go back to TI5. TI5 actually had 10 invited teams out of the 16. You had 6 qualifiers, 4 of which were the winners of the regional quals, and 2 wild cards, as the second place in the 4 region had a playoff and the top 2 got into the main field. You look at only 6 qualifiers out of 16. Well, 3 out of the top 6 teams after the group phase were among those 6 qualifier teams. And if that's not impressive enough, 3 out of the top 8 overall were qualifiers, including, get this, the 2 wild cards. I've been saying this for a long time, guys, and I'm so convinced of it. There is so much more depth in the Dota 2 scene right now. than there has been at any point since the birth of the game. There are so many teams out there that have the talent that with the right coaching and with the right staff behind them can compete at an elite level. I think you should see at most 6 directly invited teams, and I would actually like to see 3 European slots. I'd like to see 3 SEA qualifier slots coming in to Manila. I think that that's totally reasonable. I think a lot of teams in that region deserve the chance after the strong showing at Shanghai to compete on that big stage at Manila. All right. Secret, obviously, you have to have them as a winner somewhere in your analysis. I mean, what can you do? I did this for Alliance in one of my previous videos when we were talking about their run at Star Ladder 13. I looked at how much ELO ranking they gained over the course of that tournament. Well, Secret's performance during Shanghai is arguably just as impressive. You look at Secret, out of the top 15 ELO rated teams right now, Secret was 13 out of that 15 going into Shanghai. They gained over 250 ELO points. They are now the #1 rated team in the world. It is not even close. And yes, all of you are going to come back at me with, hey, stats aren't everything. Duh. ELO is flawed. Duh. But I do think that this tells a story relative to their performance before this tournament in the current patch. Secret's their run in this tournament was just absolutely stunning. You look at what Pylai, who I think deserved to be the MVP of this tournament, hands down. He went 9-2 on Lion. There were just so many examples. I got a little bit of flack, okay, for my second and third parts of my Secret article published on ESPN. Some people felt I went into a little bit too much detail about the games, but I really felt that those game-by-game analyses told a compelling story. Pylai just set up so many plays for them, disrupting the enemy team's rotation, going back and starting up those smoke ganks, really making sure, along with Puppy, that in his play calling, that team was in perfect position for fights. And I think what tells a story to me, you look at the whole tournament overall, Secret's team KDA was only almost 21 kills, over 17 deaths, and 41 assists per match if you do it on a per 35-minute basis. We're going to look in a slide or two, we're going to compare that to some of the other teams' numbers. That's actually not all that impressive, and they won the tournament. This is a team that won the tournament through team play, through great shot calling, through correct evaluation of objectives, and being in the right place on the map at the right time. I have watched now most of Team Secret's replays from Shanghai all the way through at least twice. It is honestly, if you are interested in playing Dota 2 on a team, you want to improve and see great team play, watch their replays from this tournament. Some of the games are a little bit sloppy, particularly early on, but the way that they're able to take games by winning one key fight, by taking a couple of key objectives, by establishing control of key parts of the map, it's really a crash course in Dota 2 strategy. I couldn't be more impressed with what they've done. And you look at it overall, when the dust settles, they've competed in 8 LAN events since TI5. They've won or finished second at 5 out of the 8. This is a team, I think, we all, after TI5, in the wake of the collapse of that superstar roster, I think all of us had questions about what they were going to do going forward. And I said this in my ESPN article. I'll reiterate it here. I think if there was any doubt about Puppy being the best, the most influential, the most successful captain in the history of Pro Dota 2, I think all of that doubt was erased at Shanghai. He has 299 LAN match wins. That's by far the most of any Western player. He leads S4 by more than 60 wins in this category. He, S4, and Zhao8 are the only 3 out of 28 players with 200 or more LAN matches in their career that have a 65% or more win rate in those matches. It's been true all along, but I think it's only going to get more true as the game evolves, as you see more and more teams able to compete on this elite level. That captain's role and that captain's chair is by far the most important position in the game, and I think we got to give Puppy the credit he deserves. This guy is In many ways, I feel like he's the face of the game right now. All right, so enough puppy fanboying from me. Let's talk about a couple of myths, and really I'll go three here. I have two on the slide, but a third in mind. I heard a lot of people on the panel and even a couple people afterward discussing the dire advantage at Shanghai. I think this is a little misleading. The overall win rate by Dire is about 60%, but that's really inflated. If you look at first pick Dire was 6-1 against second pick Radiant, okay? And that's what you expect. I said this all the way back in my 6.86 preview video that I thought if you looked at the changes relative to previous patches, that Dire was going to be the stronger side. And particularly when you give Dire first pick in this patch, I think you're asking to lose. But when you look at second pick Dire versus first pick Radiant, which was the majority of the games by far, it's only 44-40. So I think, yes, overall there is a Dire advantage, but when you look at most games, I don't think that Dire advantage is necessarily quite so unbalancing as people believe. Although I do think that maybe that could be addressed. Really, honestly, I think that it's kind of incomplete right now. What you're seeing, first pick has an advantage because you see there are a couple heroes like Earth Spirit that are really too good relative to the rest of the pool. I would actually like to see some more fine-tuned hero balancing before we see any more changes to the map, okay? The other big myth, and guys, it feels like I have to go into this now after every tournament. I hear people talking about EG being in trouble, and I just, you can call me a fanboy if you want. It's probably true, but I just don't see it. If you look at what they achieved statistically in this event, they had by far the highest team KDA, they had by far the highest team GPM, they had the highest team experience per minute. I mean, they're just really good, and they're playing really well, despite the fact that some of their individual players aren't necessarily playing their best Dota. Is Sumail playing the Dota that we know he's capable of playing? Absolutely not. Sumail could be playing much better individually, but you look at what this team is able to achieve as a squad, to say that they're in trouble is just ridiculous. This is 3 straight top 3 finishes at Valve LANs. This squad is arguably, to me, still a favorite at any tournament that they enter. I think it's way too early to pass judgment on this roster. I think it's way too early to talk about replacing anybody with Zai, etc. The third myth, by the way, it's not on the slide, but I brought it up before, so I wanted to mention it. There are a lot of people that talk about, oh, group stage doesn't matter, and I just hate that argument. There may be some teams that do think that way, but honestly, with due respect, because I'm usually the one that says, I think these players know more than I do, this is one issue. Honestly, as a team, if you're going into a tournament in this format with the mentality that group stages don't matter, you are playing the tournament mathematically incorrectly, okay? When you look at the difference in Shanghai in particular between being in the winner's bracket, playing best of 3 series from the start, and being able to lose one of those series and still retain your tournament life, versus being in the lower bracket where you are going to have to play back-to-back best of ones and you lose either of them and you're out of the tournament. There's just, in terms of if you run the numbers, if you look at the probabilities, you would have to believe that you had such a colossal advantage. Your delta win probability from like not playing your best in the group phase would have to be so huge going into the main event to justify not playing your best in those group stage matches. So I worry when I look at a couple of the drafts. I do worry that there were a couple of teams. OG was a team that I kind of questioned their drafts during the group stage. I think they were drafting very conservatively. They were drafting to not give anything away. Now, I think that's okay because they did end up winning their group. But I think you have to be really, really careful about that as a top team. You do not want to end up in that loser's bracket or even take a chance that you might do so. And again, if we've learned anything from these games, it's that there are more good teams out there than you think. All right, so looking ahead, and I'm going to stump a little bit on this slide too, okay? So the one thing that I'll mention that's not on this slide, there's a big story to me. I want to see how the Chinese roster shuffle unfolds because, like I mentioned before, I'm very concerned about what I've seen so far of that scene. So far, the personnel changes that I've seen have felt to me like a movement in the wrong direction rather than the right one. The other big story is I want to know where Zai ends up. Because honestly, I think it's tough right now to justify kicking somebody off EG. But for example, if Zai were to join a squad like Alliance, oh my goodness, like Alliance becomes instantly, to me, becomes one of the top 3 teams in the world. So I think that's a big story in terms of him coming back. He will be on the Daily Dots show, I understand, this week. You can tune in on Wednesday for that. I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation with him. When you look at the Manila picture, okay, this is something I wanted to do an analysis of this and I wanted to add kind of my own comments, all right? I think Secret, Liquid, and EG are your absolute locks for invites. I don't think, we discussed this before Shanghai. Secret had looked really weak in 6.86, but I don't think you're gonna not invite a top 2 team from the previous major. So I think Secret and Liquid are both in regardless of whatever else happens. EG, again, 3 straight top 3 finishes at these Valve events. I think they're in regardless. You look at the remainder of the top 8, MVP Phoenix, Complexity, Fnatic, Alliance, and OG. The big concern that I have, I think there should be 6. There may end up being 8 direct invite slots. But the big concern that I have between now and Manila, there just aren't that many tournaments being played, okay? The big unfortunate thing here, so you do have Dota Pit, which starts this weekend, and my God, if you care about the picture going forward, you absolutely must watch that tournament, okay? ESL 1 Manila is going to end up being absolutely massive. That tournament is going to be one of the most important this year in terms of its implications for what the major picture looks like. An unfortunate thing is that WePlay, which has produced some very interesting games thus far and will be in international LAN, WePlay starts on April 29th, if you look at the finals. And that's the same date that the Manila Open qualifiers are slotted to begin. And direct invites have to go out before those open qualifiers. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at only 2 major international LAN events between now and the time that direct invites from Manila will be announced. That makes these events hugely important. This is also, by the way, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but it's also why I've said these major dates need to be announced much earlier. They need to be announced at least 6 months in advance. And the reason I say this, you have a WePlay tournament that is going to be really sick. The games have been absolutely awesome thus far, and they could have scheduled 1 week earlier, and they would be much higher profile. There'd be a lot more interest because essentially they would be the decider for a number of the bids and teams' positions going into Manila. As it stands right now, they're just basically these teams going there. Some of them might actually have to have conflicts with their open qualifier matches. Probably not, but it could happen. So I really do worry about that. I do think we need to know the major dates a lot earlier so that these big LANs can plan around them. You want as many LANs as possible between the previous major ending and bids for the next one having to go out. The other thing is I think you need to look at the teams that have already qualified for the 2 big LANs that we're talking about when you discuss who's going to be on that list for direct bids to Shanghai. Really, the squads that I think have a lot of opportunity, Complexity is already qualified for both events. I think they have a very good chance if they can finish maybe top 4 in the field at both events. I don't even think they need to win either one. If they finish top 4 in the field at both events, they are easily in. And even if they finish top half in the field at both events, I think they're a very strong contender after what we saw in Shanghai. MVP Phoenix will also be at Dota Pit. It's going to be very interesting because I think a lot of people, including myself, feel surprised people early on at Shanghai. Teams are going to have had a chance to look at their replays, look at their drafts, counter their play style. I think we're going to learn a lot about that team at Dota Pit. OG, of course, will be competing at Dota Pit. They will have an opportunity. They finished top 4 there, strong showing. on the back of that Frankfurt Major Championship. I think they will be at least in the discussion, if not almost a lock for a direct invite. Empire will be competing both at Dota Pit and at ESL1 Manila. A lot of teams right now having turned down those invites to ESL1 Manila, maybe second guessing themselves. The big team that I look at, where's Alliance in all this? Alliance, despite, I think, looking pretty solid at Shanghai. You know, a lot of people talk about that series against Complexity that eliminated them as a real disappointment. You know, again, I liken that to the Alliance versus Liquid series at Starlight at 13. A lot of people talked about that as a disappointment for Liquid. That was a great, hotly contested 3-game series. Both teams should have been proud of the way they played. And I thought both Complexity and Alliance played pretty well in that series where Complexity eliminated them. I don't necessarily think Alliance should be crestfallen. The problem that they're going to have is where's the potential for that signature win that's going to solidify them an automatic invite to Manila? I don't necessarily see it there. I think both MVP Phoenix, and if MVP Phoenix compete at Dota Pit, and unfortunately only one of Fnatic or MVP Phoenix will compete at ESL1 Manila, I think that would kind of be the ideal, because that would give us the barometer for both teams in terms of how they look like against international competition in the wake of Shanghai, after other teams have seen a little bit more of their replays and have a chance to specifically compare against them. But I think still Fnatic and MVP Phoenix, obviously if you had to make the list today, I think both of them would probably make the cut along with Complexity. Empire has a real opportunity, already qualified to both of these tournaments, to move up. I don't think it's impossible that either Virtus Pro or one Chinese team might play their way into a direct invite. I think if VP finishes top 2 at Dota Pit, they still may have an argument. I think if EHOME can make it to the finals at ESL Manila with their new roster and look good in the process, there'll also be one other Chinese qualified team at ESL1 Manila. I think there's a chance there, but again, I really do think that the remainder of the direct invites, at least the majority, if not the entirety, are going to come from that list on the second line of this slide. All right, so that's this week's edition of Stats Don't Lie. Thanks very much for watching, guys. I'm looking going forward at formats and topics. Please do leave feedback in the comments below. I always love hearing from you guys. It's a fun dialogue. Until then, I will talk to you guys soon.